Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Mike Conley, who's a science writer based out of Los Angeles. He's been studying and writing about nuclear energy for over a decade. Mike, welcome to Decouple.
Howdy. How you doing?
All right, Mike, that was a pretty brief introduction. I want to know a little bit more about yourself. Feel free to just jump and give us something personal or about your interests. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, I've been a nerd all my life, and I got into fiction writing for a very long time, wrote a couple novels, and by hire, it was to novelize some screenplays. They haven't come out yet, so you haven't seen them. But my pastime has been studying different things on science and history, and I got particularly interested in molten salt reactors. And then I boned up a lot on regular reactors because I was interested in them as a child. And it kind of turned into like this retirement program of mine to get super educated in this and then try to explain what I've learned to other people. I tend to be a maven with things. I learn all about something and then I want to tell everybody about it. Yeah. And so that's kind of like where I come from. I'm a writer. I'm not a scientist.
Okay. Yeah.
I talk to scientists. I read their stuff. I'm conveying to people what I've been able to figure out from what I've studied. And that's why we back it up with a bazillion footnotes. Almost every other sentence is footnoted. Don't take my word for it. I'm the writer. They're the scientists. Ask them, read their stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, this is what I've been able to figure out. And that's it.
We'll get into some of the stuff you're working on at the end of the show. But the reason I brought you on is I wanted to talk to you about a piece that calling it a piece is not doing it justice. It's, I guess, an online book that you and your colleague, is it Tim Mahoney?
Tim
Maloney wrote, and it's called The Roadmap to Nowhere. And it's probably the best thing I've seen out there in terms of in-depth look and critique of the work of Mark Z Jacobson's. This is the Solutions Project, I always get this mixed up. It's part of the Solutions Project. But it's called the Roadmap. Is that right? Or the Roadmap for 50 states?
He has an organization called the Solutions Project. And I think from what I can tell, its main function is to devise what he calls a roadmap, a way to get to 100% renewable by 2050. And his original one in 2015, his publication, was principally about the United States. And so me and Tim wrote Roadmap to Nowhere. They basically unpacks and dismantles his program. And then he revised the damn program in 2019. And then we're like, I guess we got to revise our book. So that's what we're going to be doing any day now. We're just about to start the revision. And when it's done, it won't just be an online book. It'll be a Kindle, a hard copy, audio, etc. So what you see online is basically a first draft.
Yeah.
Well, okay, second draft, but it's not like and the website will look a lot better than it looks right now.
Yeah, it's decent, man, and it's a very navigable book. You can click through the chapters. The references are all there. So, talking a bit more about Mark Z Jacobson himself. This is a guy who I've come across because he's referenced by many politicians in particular. So, in terms of within Canada. I was speaking with some of the leadership candidates for our federal Green Party, and they were saying, listen, it's all been worked out. We're going to move towards 100% renewables. Just look at this guy's work. Talk to Mark Z Jacobson, right? And it's almost taken like kind of gospel, or there's this sort of like faith-based respect for his work without any of these folks, I think, ever having actually read the primary literature. And when I talk to when I talk to politicians, they have, with great power, as I think, as Peter Parker said in the Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. And at this moment in our history and sort of in the climate history, the decisions that we make in the next few years, they have a kind of exponential impact moving forward. The bigger the delay in controlling our carbon emissions, if we make a big mistake, if we take the wrong path, if we choose the wrong mix of technologies to decarbonize, the impacts are huge.
Well,
And I've been very troubled, I guess, by and it's not just, politicians in Canada. I think it's AOC, it's Bernie Sanders, it's a whole, it's Leonardo DiCaprio, for God's sakes.
Mark Ruffalo, he's one of the big
Sure.
spokesmen for the Solutions Project.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you said about we take the wrong path. I think what's going to wind up happening is if we go full tilt boogie on renewables, we're going to get some clean air. We're going to get some clean energy. We're going to get some progress, but we're going to spend a lot of labor and resources and land to do that, where we could spend less resources, less labor, less money, less land to do something far more efficiently. So it's a matter of taking a very inefficient path or a much more efficient path, rather than that's like the road to it's not the road to perdition. It's kind of like the road to nowhere, in the sense that you're not really going to get where you want to go, but it's not going to be a ruinous thing necessarily. If they build out wind and solar, there's going to be a lot of wasted material, and there's going to be some good energy out of it.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is, like, take your energy, resources, labor, and put it into something that will actually get you to where you want to go. Because the resources, the systems he's talking about will get us down the line. Will get us toward clean energy, but it won't get us all the way there by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that the goal is not, rapid decarbonization per se. It's to get to 100% renewables. You hear that a lot with these politicians. So I wanted to define a few terms, because I think you and Tim actually contributed something relatively unique to the literature, and that's this idea of a fuel-less system. Because I think defining renewables is a mess, right? It's this basket, really kind of a marketing basket, within which you can throw a whole bunch of different generating sources that are very different. I mean, if you want to talk about growing, Ohio corn for ethanol production, that has
works.
It's renewable. Or if you want to chop down, Carolinian forests and ship them in tankers to the Drax plant in the UK and burn those there, that's renewable. Hydro is renewable. Geothermal is renewable. Yeah. I think most of what Jacobson's talking about in this paper is wind and solar, though. So walk us through that idea of a fuel-less system.
Well, here's the thing, essentially, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is, I can't remember, some big promoter of wind and solar, some big guru about, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he was touting it as a free fuel system. And it's not, it's a fuel-free system, two very different things. The term renewables gained cachet, I think, in the 70s or 80s. And what it basically means is the sun comes up every day. So your fuel comes back. It's not fuel. It's an ambient natural phenomenon that you can set up a gizmo to exploit it by generating energy out of things that happen in nature when and if they happen. That's fuel free, not free fuel. Because wind and solar are not fuel. And we have a section in our new book that's coming out. I want to talk to you about that in a minute. And the title of it is, unless you can put sunshine in your pocket, it's not a fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Fuel is portable, transportable, stable stuff that you can use with the right machine to get energy when and where you need it.
Mm-hmm.
Wind and sunshine are not fuel. They are, as I said, ambient natural phenomena. And so wind and solar renewables are energy harvesting equipment, where reactors are energy production equipment.
Right.
The problem with going toward a fuel-free renewable system is that, in the largest sense, is we can't predict the weather in 30 years. We can sort of kind of maybe predict the climate in general terms, but we can't predict the weather enough to determine, well, if we have these many solar panels and these many windmills, in 2050, we'll be okay. You can take historical weather patterns and run your little model, which is what he did, and which is what Christopher Clack did. and go, look, our model ran through this weather period, these 3 years of very detailed weather from 2006 to 2008. And here's the papers from the whatever government thing. So these are the weather patterns. And look, our system of wind and solar and transmission got through that for 3 years. Therefore, we're cool. No, you're not. Texas freeze. No one saw that. No one saw that coming.
Right.
And as you pump more energy into a system, the global atmosphere, you're going to get any system with more energy is more chaotic.
Yeah.
It's the nature of the beast. So we're in a more and more chaotic climate system, and they're trying to use models of historical weather to show that their stuff will work 30 years from now. The AMOC could stop 30 years from now.
What's the AMOC? Sorry.
The Atlantic Meridian Overturning system.
Right. Is that what brings warm weather to Europe?
Yeah. Yeah. Benjamin Franklin discovered the Gulf Stream, water coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, going up the eastern seaboard and warming England. Yeah. So England has temperature like what, Washington, D.C. or like New York City. Not even New York City doesn't get that cold. Right. It's because the warm water. When that stops and it's flowing because there's so much ice melt on Greenland that when it gets up there, it lessens the salinity of the water, and the salt is the weight that causes it to cool and drop. So if it isn't dropping, then that slows down. I'm getting somewhere with this. And so if Norfolk, Virginia starts being like Maine in December because the AMOC slows, then your system that you based on 2006 to 2008 weather ain't gonna cut it.
Right. And
everyone, excuse me, one last thing, every roadmap I've seen, they take past weather modeling and they show that their stuff works with that model. I'm like, what does that have to do with 2050?
Right. And so listen, we're going to go into some granular detail into aspects of Jacobson's roadmap and your critique of it. But just for our listeners, in broad terms, what are we talking about here? We're talking about essentially, I think, a fuelless system you've described it as, with very little, there's a lot of overbuild, but very little, and very little backup, right? There's very little redundancy built into this plan, and a little bit of storage, right? But could you just give us a bird's eye view of this so that our listeners can sort of understand, I guess, what we're critiquing, and then we'll get into the details afterwards.
Oh, okay. Well, he plans for, oh God, I think about 50%, roughly 50% wind and 50% solar, overbuilt, I think 3 to 5 times. He took the average of the efficiency of those two systems, because wind is like 40-ish and solar's like 20-ish or whatever, 30 to, anyway, he's taking an average of 21%. We dug in because we read his paper, every single page. It was a plow. He's taking an average wind and solar efficiency of just 21%, which means he's overbuilding by 5 times. So if you want a 1 gigawatt solar farm and you really want to get 1 gigawatt out of it, he builds 5 gigawatts. So you'll average 1 gigawatt of production over the course of a year, which means you have a lot of overbuild that's sitting idle.
Yeah.
That just comes in on a rainy day. Theoretically, he used to have, in his 2015 plan, his idea was to add a lot of generators to our existing dams so we can have instant power for like a short-term battery. Well, that got fricasseed about 8 ways from Sunday in the scientific community, and he even sued Christopher Clack and then withdrew the suit because Clack had the temerity to dismantle his program in front of the world. And we did the same thing in our own little way. So Clack's getting sued, we're writing, we're like, oh my God, he's getting sued, we got to be nice. Oh, he won, now we can say what we want. You know, basically his idea now is a bunch of wind and a bunch of solar. The other stuff is basically decimal dust. And
the rationale is that the sun's always shining somewhere, the wind's always blowing somewhere. So you got to interconnect all this stuff, right?
But then there's 2 key things with this. Number one is the idea is to rig the whole thing together with a national infrastructure, a parallel grid of high voltage DC. Okay, so he's saying that about a third of his wind and solar will be way out in the boonies, a third or 60%, one or the other. A big chunk of it's going to be way out in the boonies, and we'll have to run wires through them. In other words, new areas rather than expanding an existing solar field and an existing wind field. We got new areas we have to exploit because we need so much energy. So you build all this stuff out in the middle of nowhere, and then you got to run an HVDC transmission cable because, like you said, the wind's always blowing somewhere. Okay, fine, but you got to get it from A to B.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do it is over the national high voltage transmission system. And there's two problems about that. One, it's incredibly expensive. Number three problems. Two, you got to run it through everybody's backyards. You can have lawsuits up the wazoo. And then number three, which most people don't know, if you have an HVDC line going from Montana to Chicago, okay, and let's say you have a wind farm in Wyoming and you want to like add it onto that cable, you got to go to the beginning of the cable.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's DC. You can't tap into a DC cable in the middle because it'll all go there. It's 100% drain. And so what you have is what we call an agapanthus model. An agapanthus is a flower, a bush in Southern California with a long stalk and then a bunch of smaller stalks.
Yeah.
Okay. And rather than buds all up the stalk, all the buds are on top on small stalks. And it's the same concept is you're going to run a main HVDC from the boonies to where the power is going to be used. And all that power has to feed into the beginning of the cable to get to the end of the cable.
Right.
And so the amount of short distance transmission and the HVDC, we started adding all this stuff up and giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's like $1 trillion just for the wiring, not the lawsuits.
Right.
Just the wiring. And then if you go underground to avoid the lawsuits, then it's 3 or 4 times it's cheaper per mile, but there's more miles, so it's more expensive. Go along existing public rights of way, a trench beside the railroad track, etc. But the undergrounding of cables is frightfully more expensive than towers. So you have those, so that's the dilemma he has. And then the thing that capped his thing off was he wanted to basically use the national dams when and as needed as a battery backup.
Right. And this I remember, I think they were referencing, maybe it was the Grand Coulee Dam. And the idea was just I think he was criticized on going from 80 gigawatts. He wanted to scale hydro up to 1,300 gigawatts without building new dams, just putting more turbines in. Right. And then if they were using these as kind of peaking devices, I think I think it was the Clack paper that talked about this, the amount of water that would be released from a dam with all these extra turbines would be higher than these historic 100-year floods on the Colorado, and they just wash away. I don't know my geography well, but they'd wash away a lot of real estate, a lot of cities, I think, along the way, right?
Yeah, well, not only that, but shit, I forgot my point. That happens to me sometime, but his what it was, the Clack came out. That's what I remember now. Clack came out and said, you know, if you were to trigger all this water, the amount of water it requires to get that 13 gigawatts or whatever. 1,300,
yeah.
Thank you. The amount of water would be equal to another Mississippi River.
Wow.
And so I think that's where Jacobson got really mad and then he sued him. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
this you know, I was talking to actually he came within about 800 votes of becoming the federal Green Party leader, and I gave him a call because I wanted to talk to him a little bit about environmental policy. He was backed by Helen Caldicott. He referenced Mark Z Jacobson. We had a really productive call, and you know, one of the things, he's actually a very prominent lawyer. He's done a lot of class action suits. I talked to him about Mark Z Jacobson's lawsuit and against Christopher Clack and I think the PNAS, I forget what that stands for, the National Publication of the National Academy of Science. Anyway, this $10 million lawsuit, and he said, "Wait a minute, that's a SLAPP suit. That's a strategic litigation against public participation." And he was like, "Give me a second," and he kind of went offline and looked it up, and he was absolutely shocked. And it really it created this big opening for him, I think, to reconsider.
That's where we put my book, in that opening.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? Yeah, so that book and the other one we're just finishing right now. But he built a system. he built his system and then he modeled it on historical weather, which
Right.
makes it I got two words for that: Texas freeze.
Yeah,
Want
exactly.
another two words? Polar vortex. You want another
Right.
word? AMOC. But
And
anyway,
and the big difference to me seems to be, and I think I'm drawing off your ideas, right? Because they've really integrated themselves like little mind worms into my head here. It was a very influential read that your book was, but I think traditional, at least electricity generation systems, the idea is you bring a fuel to a power plant that's relatively close to a load center, right? And that way you can take advantage of a smaller, more efficient grid. You can produce power close to where it's needed. You don't need to build an insane amount of transmission infrastructure. Whereas because the system is fuelless, and the best wind and solar sites are often, like as in Texas, quite a ways from your population centers in Austin and Dallas. I think they just
yeah,
spent
no one
over,
wants to build in a windy
yeah.
whatever.
So,
Yeah,
so I think Texas, they spent five, I think that it was the public as well, not the renewables investors, but the ratepayer who had to pay, I think, $5 to $6 billion to connect all of that wind down to the population center. So that's,
yeah.
I think that's a really, and that fits into your kind of fueled versus fuelless system
Right.
analogy.
Well, regarding that, I mean, to me, the Texas freeze validated it confirmed the folly of renewables, gas plus
Right.
renewables backed by gas. And to me, it confirmed the wisdom of small modular reactor true local power. And I'll tell you what, in Texas, they have a gas, they have all this gas all over the place, which that's Texas. And but in Texas, as in any grid, the gas first goes to homes to keep them heated.
Yeah.
So when it's super freeze, the power plants have less gas to make electricity to run everything else. Number one. Number two, pipes were breaking and methane was leaking because a gas plant can't store gas on site. It's a just-in-time system,
Yeah.
which means your delivery system can never fail or your plant will fail. A nuclear reactor has 2 years worth of fuel in the core.
Yeah.
And if, for example, let's invent a town Impala, Texas. Let's just invent a town, Impala, Texas. And they had a bunch of renewables and they're backed by gas. And the wind turbines stopped because it was too cold and the panels were doing fine, but there wasn't enough. And then the gas was being used by houses and then the pipeline broke. Forget all that. If you had a couple of small modular reactors, two of them, one to back each other up when they're offline, you could supply all the electricity, the heat, the desalination, and making hydrogen fuel locally. Your fuel is at the power plant.
Yeah.
Which happens to a small degree with coal, but they're bringing it in every day. But a coal plant can run for maybe a day or so with what they have on site. A
Yeah.
gas plant can run for maybe 2 seconds with what they have on site.
Yeah.
A reactor can run for 2 years with what they have on site, and you can throw a hurricane at the thing. Remember Harvey and Irma and Maria, the 3 hurricanes about 3 years ago?
Yeah.
We had reactors in Texas and Florida, and they were kind of like, oh gosh, it's windy outside. And then that's it. When you take a look at the Puerto Rico solar fields, and it looks like Godzilla versus Kong had a fist fight there.
Yeah.
So that's,
so that's very interesting, and I think Bill Gates talks about that in his more recent book about Tokyo and how they have a lot of typhoons, and it's not even an issue of not getting enough wind sometimes, but too much and needing to curtail. Anyway, big city.
yeah.
But I mean, Jacobson's not just talking about decarbonizing electricity. He's talking about transportation, heating, cooling,
all energy,
shipping, industry.
primary energy. What are you calling that?
How does this happen?
That's the thing, is he has to build an enormous amount of wind and solar covering 132,000 square miles.
So this is the other issue, Mike, is I think, and I think you guys did a pretty decent job of this. It's probably the biggest challenge I see when looking at energy literacy is this issue of numeracy, understanding these big numbers and communicating them well. That blows my mind. And one of the facts that you guys shared that I think was useful for me, that helped me understand the scale, was this idea that, we do this build out for the next, I guess it's 29 years now, but I guess when it was written, 35 years, we're adding all this capacity. When we finally get to Mark Z Jacobson's plan, again, if we have a World War II level mobilization, economic diversion just to this for 35 years, we arrive there, and then we're stuck, with fairly short-lived infrastructure. And the solar panels, you were calculating, you needed to replace, I think, 1.23 square kilometers of solar panels every day forever.
Yeah, square meters, and what that is 1.23 million square, I think it's square meters a panel. I forget the numbers. I mean, we're going to get back into revising the book any day now. But generally, you're going to have those panels, that many panels, replaced every day forever. 1.23 million square meters of panels. And that's not the size of the solar field. That's the size of the actual panel itself.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Two big different things. And so we're talking about 1.23 million square meters of actual panel that would need to be replaced in his 2015 program every single day forever. And then I think a couple of dozen windmills that have to be fully refurbished, and of course new blades
every day.
And a third of those will be in deep water at sea. And when we were writing Roadmap to Nowhere in 2015, wind refurbishment was so new, we had to find a company in France to give us a ballpark quote on what it would take to refurbish a windmill, wind turbine. And it basically came out to around 10% of the installation costs. But of course, you got to add, what does it take to go out to sea and do that?
Right.
And we haven't gotten the numbers on that yet, but it's got to be horrific.
Yeah, I mean, I just interviewed a guy named Alan Levinovitz on his book Natural, which really takes a look at the naturalistic fallacy. But I think for a lot of people, solar panels and wind turbines, because of the excellent marketing, kind of disappear into a landscape and are sort of interpreted almost as if they're part of the biosphere, almost like trees maybe. And the idea that they need maintenance, that there's a gearbox up there with seals and fluids, and that the blades themselves, especially out at sea, get damaged by salt, and that they need to be looked after and babied. I think people just assume
the blades can't really be recycled.
And you hear politicians saying, well, once it's built, it's there forever. I mean, again, there's just this enormous energy illiteracy in the political class that it's
or it'll last 25 years until I'm dead, and then my ancestors will take care of it or whatever. But with a wind and solar system, you have continuous maintenance of all that stuff for freaking ever.
I mean, and that's true of nuclear, for instance. But
but nuclear is an operations and maintenance cost for a nuclear power plant is a lot less than the similar cost than the cost for the same peak capacity, average capacity of wind and solar. And so if you go, well, this reactor takes $1 million a month to keep open, it's going to take $1 million a month to service the wind and the solar by comparison. So it's pretty much a wash. Also, the reactor lasts about 60 to 80 years.
And that's this idea, I think, of decarbon. Like, we have this, I think a lot of arguments against nuclear is, listen, we have to act immediately. It's quicker to put up wind and solar farms, if nuclear takes 10 years to build. But there's also this concept of decarbonization durability, right? So if you're building infrastructure that needs to get replaced so quickly, that has really big implications, again, in terms of, go ahead.
Well, there's two things about that. Number one, nuclear is expensive. It takes a long time to build in the United States.
Yeah.
In Asia, they're building reactors on time and on budget. What's the budget? About $3,000 an installed
megawatt, I think, right?
Kilowatt, right? Installed kilowatt, that's the standard. About 3,000 installed kilowatt. Give you an example. The South Koreans built 4 reactors in the United Arab Emirates on time and on budget. In fact, the last one was 20% faster. The time period was 20% faster because they got used to building the same damn reactor. But then they got to the 4th one, they go, I know where this part goes. No, you don't put that in now because it'll screw you up. Remember what happened last time? They get better at it.
Yeah.
Okay. They have a mature supply chain, and they were building reactors at, I think those were 4,300 in installed kilowatt. In South Korea, the same reactor is 2,500 in installed kilowatt. Same reactor.
Yeah.
Just between you and me, I happen to think it has to be with something like bribes, to pay off people to build, which jacks up the price.
Right.
Maybe because the supply line got lengthened, but it isn't that much more expensive. Anyway, China is building Hualong 1 reactors, which are the same that we've been trying to build in Georgia, Vogel, the
Yeah.
big mess we had at Vogel, Georgia. They're building them at $3,000 an installed kilowatt. Our Vogel is costing 12 to 14. Why? In the middle of building Vogel, Fukushima happened.
Yeah.
Vogel's 300 miles upriver from the Gulf of Mexico, which doesn't have tsunamis anyway. They had to backfit the reactor with tsunami-proof stuff. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
In the middle of building it. Whereas the Chinese and the Koreans will go, ain't gonna get up here, just keep building the thing.
Yeah.
And if you have a problem with a reactor's generators being flooded, put the damn things 100 feet up in the air in a tower.
Mhm.
Why is that so complicated?
Yeah.
You know.
So let's get back a little bit to the roadmap to nowhere, and to your analysis again. To me, it seems like there's a lot of effort, I think, to write nuclear out of the decarbonization story, and so there's this kind of construction of a Rube Goldberg machine, because of this, intolerance of nuclear energy, and Jacobson himself, he's quite anti-nuclear, and
he says we don't need nuclear, and then he
right.
comes up with a program that requires 1,300 gigawatts.
Mm-hmm. And he has some like life cycle carbon analysis of nuclear. Can you entertain us?
Oh, that's a good one. What Jacobson did is he looked at the amount of CO2 emissions that came from the firestorms on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then he went, well, the more reactors you build, the more chance there is of nuclear war, which is another fallacy. We can get to that in a minute. So therefore, we're going to have some bombs go off every now and then because people can get mad at each other, and look at all the firestorms. Therefore, the nuclear is high carbon. Well, here's a couple things on that. Number one, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were almost entirely built of wood. Modern population centers are not. That's not to justify nuclear bombs. But the other thing is he has this idea, and a lot of anti-nuclear people do, that reactors lead to weapons. Well, not really. Reactors don't lead to weapons. Weapons lead to reactors. What I mean by that is you don't need at all a civilian nuclear power program. Oh, we're going to supply electricity to our people to secretly build a bomb in the backyard when no one's looking, because you got all this nuclear equipment laying around that you're using for you're not going to hide a bomb. It's one of the worst ways to hide a bomb program, because any nuclear system, any nuclear infrastructure is going to get a lot of attention from the IAEA. They're going to be there every day, not blinking, watching what you do with everything that they measure down to the gram.
Yeah.
So if you want to attract attention, build a civilian reactor. You get the IAEA coming out of your ears.
Yeah.
Israel and North Korea built a bomb without providing 1 watt of nuclear electricity to their citizens.
Yeah.
Because the way to build a bomb is far, 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 far more efficient, cheap, and discreet. Building a plutonium bomb with something called a small production reactor than hijacking a commercial power reactor that everybody's watching, including spy satellites.
Yeah. I think probably the worry is, it's just the knowledge, right? If you train enough physicists up, then I can kind of buy that argument, but I think you're absolutely correct in terms of trying to harvest nuclear material out of the waste stream of a nuclear plant.
Well, I'll tell you how that idea falls apart. Is you can build a Hiroshima bomb in your garage. A guy in Michigan did one. He was a physics major who became a long haul trucker and built a full tilt boogie, 100% exact replica functioning of the Hiroshima bomb in his garage, except of course for the pit, which is the uranium that has to be slammed together with bags of nitrocellulose.
Mm-hmm.
the bomb, that Hiroshima bomb, was actually a 105 millimeter howitzer barrel with a half of uranium at each end is slammed together by a conventional explosive.
Yeah.
But anyway, he built the whole thing right down, and then he invited the Department of Energy over, and they flipped out. They were like, "Where'd you get the plans?" They're in textbook. The plans have been in textbooks since 1945.
Right. Yeah.
The genie's been out of the bottle for 70 years. So the problem with the uranium bomb is you can build the bomb easy, but it's hellaciously difficult, and you need a nation state to enrich enough uranium to make the bomb.
Yeah.
You can easily make plutonium-239 with a small, discrete reactor you can hide in a cave, which is what North Korea did. But building the bomb is far more difficult. I mean, you have to be like a factory full of Ferrari mechanics to figure out how to build a plutonium implosion device, because it has to be built very precisely to squeeze the plutonium just perfectly, or it'll fist.
Yeah.
So it's either easy to build the bomb and hard to get the material, or hard to build the bomb and easier to get the material. So basically, you pretty much can't get there from here unless you're a nation state, because even if you're a small, discrete production reactor to make the plutonium in a cave, you still got to fuel that thing. That's a lot of fuel. Where are you going to get all that fuel? And nobody's going to notice, except for the black market. So now you're Korea and Pakistan, North Korea. And so it's just like this whole thing, oh my God, more reactors are going to have bombs. It doesn't work out in the real world that way.
Yeah. Let's jump back in, because this question of numeracy and like in science communication, I think one of the biggest challenges is trying to communicate big numbers. I was reading up on this recently, and we spent most of our evolution as hunter-gatherers and small bands, maybe up to 100 people. Those were the kind of numbers we needed to think about. And now we're being asked to talk about, petawatts, for God's sakes, right? And, a recent thing I read was talking about, just trying to illustrate that. And I was saying, if you stack, $1,100 bills, it's about 4 inches high. If you stack $1 million, $1,000 or $100 bills, it's about a football field. And if you stack $1 billion, it's about the height of the atmosphere, right? And I think, when people are confronted with these numbers, I think Jacobson's plan calls for 500,000 5 megawatt wind turbines.
Right.
It's just kind of number soup, or the equivalent of alphabet soup for people. But
they don't get the number.
Tell us what a 5 megawatt wind turbine looks like. I don't know if you have the facts off the back of your hand in terms of what goes into building that. Roughly, the concrete.
It's as tall as a 40-story building, and each blade is longer than the wingspan of a 747. And if you just want to know how big they are, check out a video on YouTube about moving those blades through the countryside to get them to the wind turbine place.
Right.
These things are huge. I mean, they're really freaking big. I mean, they're ginormous, these blades. And you got to install them. The crane costs $350,000 a week to rent. You got to install them, and then when you take them apart, you got this blade that's longer than a football field, and you have to chop it up, because you can't recycle it, because it's wood covered resin, and you can't melt the resin down. It's 4,000 degrees to melt it. So the only thing you do is chop it into big pieces for a landfill, or small pieces like bulk up concrete. And so you have enormous, monstrous, humongous generating equipment to get a little bit of energy, and then you have to tear the thing down and chop it all up and put up new blades. And it's like you're going through all this stuff, and all of it's all a workaround based on nuclear fear. Let me give you a thought experiment. If the only thing that ever came out of a nuclear reactor was chocolate syrup, we would have 100% nuclear planet by now. And so the thing is nuclear fear, and the fear of the material, that is making people go through all these Rube Goldbergian hoops because they can't consider nuclear. And then they've been assured by people like Jacobson that we don't need nuclear. The truth is we don't need renewables.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was watching Václav Smil give a lecture, and for those of you who don't know, Václav Smil is Bill Gates' guy in terms of, he's a Canadian academic who's written a lot about energy transitions. He's probably the most numerate guy that I've come across. just a polymath and encyclopedic knowledge of, industrial history, prime movers, biology. He's a really fascinating guy, but he talks about the German Energiewende. And he says, listen, before the Energiewende, which was the build out of renewables, there was 90 gigawatts of installed capacity with, traditional resources like coal, gas, and nuclear. And then they spent the last 20 years building about 110 gigawatts of wind and solar, but they haven't actually got rid of that 90 gigawatts of underlying power. So now they've got this kind of 2 times overbuild. They've got 200 gigawatts going. But the reality is, with, like, I think as you're saying, you don't need the renewables because you need a firm backup that's capable of meeting 100% demand. And
yeah, well, there's one thing that Tim articulated that we put in our new book that's just brilliant. And the thing is renewables are marginal energy resources. And what that's not necessarily a pejorative term. Marginal is what is added to the fringes of an established system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Renewables work now because they are backed up by a fueled system or the big battery of a hydro dam. Right. A hydro dam is basically a battery, and then you got coal and gas and nuclear and some petroleum, which is fueled plants, okay? They're riding on top of an established stable system. So they are a marginal player and always will be, because the center of any system in biology, you have to have a stable core. You have to have a stable center. You have to have the heart of the system has to be stable and robust. Mm-hmm. And then you add peripherals. You got to have a good computer. Then you can add the speakers on the screen, right? Renewables are the speakers on the screen, and they're going, we don't need the computer. Mm-hmm. And it's silly because to replace a fueled system, you need so much overbuild, and you're going to need so many batteries. Jacobson's new plan called for 4 hours of battery storage at each wind farm and at each solar farm, 4 hours. And then you add we added all this stuff up, and it's like, it's just going to cost X amount of money that you got to keep on replacing stuff. And probably the best example is Germany's Energiewende, like you mentioned. They spent 580 billion on wind and solar, and they've lowered their carbon by 4 or 5%. They could have spent half of that money, fully half of that money, and nuclearized the entire energy system of the entire country. That's all power. That's heating, desalination, process heat for industry, all power, primary power, every form of power you can freaking imagine. Syn fuel for jet planes, hydrogen if you really want it. Long story short, they could have completely nuclearized their entire country for half of what they spend on renewables, and they've only dropped their carbon by about 4%. They're still at about 420 carbon per kilowatt?
Yeah.
Something like that. And France is at 40 or 44. France is 75% nuclear, and they did it in 10 years because they said, we will build reactors and we will build this one and get rid of all that other stuff. And we just concentrate on building that and get really good at building it, and concentrate on building, get really good at building that, and just build the damn system.
Yeah.
With the same reactor.
I want to take you to task a little bit because I mean, you guys were comparing a 100% renewable system to a theoretical 100% nuclear system, and of course you said this is not realistic because there's going to be hydro. We've already built a bunch of renewables. We're never going to build a 100% nuclear system. You guys looked at 2 models. One was using existing, I think, Gen 3 and Gen 3 plus nuclear, and the other was using something like Thorcon, molten salt. I mean, I think just again, like referencing Václav Smil, he was like, energy transitions take a long time. I mean, I think he was talking about natural gas, the original patents on it, and some of the infrastructure for it, and on and compressing it go back to the early 1900s, or I think even the late 1890s, and
right.
Only now is it starting to be 10, 15, 20% of our energy infrastructure. It seemed like there was a little bit of potential over optimism on taking the numbers given by a company like Thorcon and saying like, okay, this is how we're going to estimate our numbers.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, in the renewable field, when we really get into discussions online with people, their fallback position, their trump card is always, well, panel prices are dropping and energy storage is getting cheaper. So by the time we get there, we'll be fine. So we did the same thing with nuclear. We were like, well, if you can use forward-looking statements with technology that's still on the bench, then we'll do the same. And so back at you, you know. However, the main thrust of our book is with existing technology, it would still be cheaper by about half the cost of wind and solar. And molten salt reactors would make that half of that. So it'd be 4 times less expensive than wind and solar. Molten salt's down the line. So, but we use the same optimism that they use. We look at our attitudes like it's, hey, if you can solve your problem or prove your case by saying, well, battery prices are dropping and windows are getting bigger and it'll all work out, why can't we do the same?
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely possible. I mean, and like imagining, you know, I forget how many molten salt reactors your plan calls for, the number of Gen 3 plants. I mean, I think Gen 3 plants was something like 2,000. I mean, that's, you know, I believe in the absolute urgency of dealing with climate change, and I'd like to see a build out happen as quickly as possible. But I mean, just even in China, where they're thumping out reactors these days, unfortunately, it's going to take us a long time, I think.
It's going to take a long time unless the country gets like France. We have a national energy policy.
Yeah,
that sounds vaguely socialistic. Too damn bad.
Yeah,
you know, when you're in a lifeboat, you don't really, capitalism, pure unfettered libertarian capitalism doesn't work. You got to band together and make some group decisions. When you get to shore, you can start planting bananas and sell them to each other. But right now we're in a lifeboat. When we're in a lifeboat, you need something like a lifeboat policy, where you're not going to sit in the back with your scarf trying to catch the wind when this guy's rowing over here.
Yeah.
You know, so everybody sticks together. And the way France did it is they picked 2 easily built reactor designs, and they just built the same damn reactor over and over again.
Yeah.
And you could literally run the whole country on probably Model A cars if you just built nothing but Model A's, and you could work on a system that would work. It would be the most efficient, but it'd be easy to make and it would work. I'm using that as a gross analogy, but the point is, the problem with American nuclear is every time somebody comes out with a new reactor, you know, it's sort of like we have a fleet of hand-built hypercars, and what we need is a fleet of boring sedans.
Yeah, yeah.
We need checker cabs. You know, we need 5,000 checker cabs. We don't need 3 Lamborghinis and 18 McLarens and see which one's best. This is just brute, mechanical, knucklehead. We need this energy. This thing works. I mean, really, we need somebody like Curtin. Like, who was the guy that ran the Pentagon back during Leslie Groves? Build it. That's it. We need that. This thing works. Build 5,000 of them. I'll be back in a year. You know, rather than, oh, let's try this and we could try that. So what we did is he has a 100% renewable system. And we said, okay, we're going to show you how your 100% is BS, because we'll take 100% nuclear and wipe your butt with that. So don't get too cocky about renewables will handle the whole thing. You really got to think this through. You know, and that's what we're trying to get people to do, is like, if you were to have 100% nuclear, it'd be ridiculously cheaper. It'd be ridiculously less land. It would be a sliver of the land.
So how do you communicate that land footprint? Because I find that's challenging.
Well, I'm kind of comparing it to a state, but how do you, like, you know, we might have to, in our revision, we have to do like take Los Angeles and go, okay, you have X amount of square miles. If you need X amount of square miles for the wind and solar, the solar field will be as big as the city. Where are you going to get all that land? And then here's the thing, where are you going to get all that land to put all your stuff on? They never talk about that. No land is free.
Right.
The feds, the BLM, not Black Lives Matter, the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM charges wind and solar leasing for the land and the production fees. And they can't lower their prices lower than private landholders because it's the government going into competition with private industry. So they have to have their leasing and production prices at least where the landholders are. The landholders want to raise their fees, but they can't do it without the BLM doing it as well, because then the BLM's underselling them. You follow me? So the BLM is kind of like in business without being in business. Right. You know, long story short, all that wind and solar that Mark Jacobson talks about, 132,000 square miles we've calculated, you got to lease that land. And you have to pay the owner of that land a production fee, meaning if you whatever megawatt you produce, you got to give me a nickel, or whatever. It's called a production fee. So when we added up in the revision the leasing and production fees for all the land he needed, and it's like $1 trillion or something like that. It's ridiculous. Reactors take a sliver of the land. I mean, you could run New York City on a couple square miles of nuclear plants.
I mean, that's how we do it up in Ontario. And it's interesting as well, because I think there's this whole question of, and like you were saying, I mean, it's a very interesting, there's the lifeboat ethics of Paul Ehrlich, which was, what if there's, too many people in the world, do you allow them on your boat and sink your boat? And you're talking about a different sort of lifeboat ethics where we're in this crisis and we all need to sort of pull the oars together and get to land and cooperate. But, I think one of the difficulties for nuclear right now is that we've moved to a sort of very neoliberal, liberalized energy markets where there's not state or public funding or even low interest bonds or loans that are made available to build the infrastructure that we need. And when you look at the kind of sheer scale that's required, and I think Jacobson's study does a good job of showing, okay, you really want to do this? This is what it looks like. It's 500,000 35-story wind turbines. But, in Ontario, for instance, because of our in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, we had sort of federal provincial cooperation, and we built these power plants, one of which basically powers Toronto, and we put 8 reactors in one plant, right? And so, I think Ontario is actually pretty, other than China, and I think one site in France, we're pretty unique for that in terms of just that concentration on such a small land footprint. We have a plant that produces, I think, around 6,000 megawatts. The one near Toronto, 3.2 is what it was built for. So it's if you have a system and you understand the sort of crisis that we're in, and you are able to harken back to those kind of politics, I mean, maybe that's just not possible with how things have changed. I know, like our nuclear company, CANDU Industries was privatized, and part of the shame of that is that it really takes government out of the equation in terms of funding a new build.
The way I look at it is the infrastructure of a country. Energy is probably the most vital infrastructure. With that energy, you can run a pump and pull water out of the ground. So to me, maybe it's because I'm in this field of interest, energy is number one. Energy is not really a commodity, although it's treated as such. It's more fundamental than the commodity. If you look at the world as a monopoly board, we're playing Monopoly on a very rickety card table, and energy undergirds that system. It's part of the game board. It's not something you buy and sell on the board. It's part of the actual game board. The actual game board is made up of resources and energy, material and energy, right? And it's finite. The game board is finite, and if you use material and use energy gathering systems that cannot be withdrawn from the natural world, then you're going to be a slave to the natural world, which is what decouple is all about. If you want to keep 10 billion people alive on this planet, you have to decouple its footprint from nature as much as humanly possible, no pun intended. Because if you want to get back to nature on this planet, step number one, get rid of 9 billion people. Who wants to be first? Because that's basically it. And so the wind and solar people are like, we got to be in harmony with nature and go with nature's ebb and flow, sunshine and wind. And it's kind of like, you can't run the planet like that because we have too many people. If you have to decouple your energy system from nature to be in harmony with nature. If you want to be in harmony with your horse, get the 9 people off its back and walk beside it, and not need the horse for transportation, because you got a bicycle, but you can take your horse for a walk, because it's a fragile old horse like this planet, and it can't take 9 people sitting on its back. You know?
Yeah, I mean,
so
when I was talking with Alan Levinovitz, we were talking a bit about this, and I mean, nature's way of kind of keeping human population in balance is to kill kids under 5 years old. That's always been the mechanism, right? And we have to decide if we're up for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we used to be hunters and gatherers and living in harmony in nature. And as soon as we moved from agriculture to agriculture, we changed that equation. You know, and the thing is when we started pulling oil out of the ground, we really changed the equation, because that gave us energy. Energy undergirds civilization. It also comes prior to money. Money is an outgrowth of energy. If you have energy, you can make your business that you need and you want, you make your money. Energy undergirds everything. It's not just simply a commodity. When it's treated as such, you get nonsense of what happened in Texas, where Texas was this libertarian like wonderland where everybody can do what the hell they want, and all everybody wants to do is put money in their pocket.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the function of government is to provide for the people what the people can't well provide for themselves. And when you have a statewide or national grid that everybody wants to plug into, it doesn't work to have a bunch of private marketeers contributing or not to that system, because there was no financial incentive to build up reliability and redundancy and backup in the Texas system. There was more of a financial incentive to make energy systems than to make the grid robust.
Right.
Right.
So
the thing is they went, well, we couldn't predict this weather. Well, you're not going to predict the weather in 2050 or 2060 either. So any modeling that you see, like Jacobson's, that says, oh, we ran all this weather through it and it works. Well, number one, Jacobson's weather model has never been peer reviewed. It's never been accepted. It's been rejected by all sorts of people. I could dig up the references, but it's not a sanctioned, approved, blessed model by the scientific community, number one. Number two, Clack ran, I think, a 3-year energy analysis with his system. His paper came out recently. And again, you can't tell me what's good for 2050 by looking at weather from 10 years ago and running it as a model, because black swan, Texas freeze, global warming, AMOC, polar vortex, etc. Until you can model a black swan, which you can't model a fuel-free system for a climate system that will result in weather that we can't predict.
So, Mike, how has you've been looking a little bit, I think, at Jacobson's revisions? I mean, Jacobson's not the only one who's making up 100% renewables plans. How have they responded to the criticisms? How are the new plans looking different? Are they making any substantive changes that resolve some of these contradictions?
Yeah, Jacobson got beat up pretty good with his nonsense about adding generators to our dams for instant power. So what he did instead is he put 4 hours of battery at each of his wind and solar plants. And I think the wind plants, are more than 50,000 plants. So you got a bunch of batteries, you got a bunch of wind and solar, and if you string it all together with a national high voltage direct current system, it could probably work. I'm not saying it's not going to work, but except for the fact that it was modeled on weather that exists, and we don't know what the weather will be there.
And when would we know if it does work? I think that was a key point that you guys were making.
When will you work that it does work?
Because it all depends on each other, right? It's all interconnected.
Yeah, but at a certain point, it's going to really start supporting each other to where wind in Vermont can take care of a cloudy day in Austin, Texas, because they could just shift the energy down HVDC. You can't do it AC, and you can't do it with our existing system, because our existing system is AC. And the border, the interconnects between those systems are only a couple of portals. And you have to get the energy in. Let's say you want to transmit wind energy from Wyoming to Texas, okay? You got to ship that wind energy on an AC line in that um, 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 I forget what they call it, that region. And to get over the border into Texas, it's converted to DC, shipped over DC, and then it's synced up to match the AC pulse in Texas. You can't ship it direct. You can ship it direct if it's DC, then you convert it to AC where you're using it. But then you have the problem of building a national HVDC system. Again, building a national HVDC system of 2,000 or 3,000, no more than that. Tim calculated it out. I think it's over 10,000 miles of line. You know, and it's $1 million a mile just for the parts, then the land, and then the lawsuits. Good luck with that.
And what is the? I mean, we're going to be talking later this week with Mark P. Mills, who's done a lot of looking at the mining footprint. You guys looked a bit at the materials intensity of this system. I mean, we're talking again this massive HVDC transmission grid that basically duplicates the existing grid. We're talking 4 hours of battery storage at every site. And again, we're not talking about, you know, windmill in everyone's backyard or kind of democratized small scale energy. Like, I think the way a lot of Greens think about this is that, well, with wind and solar, the community can control it because it's smaller in scale. We're talking about 35-story, you know, hundreds of tons of steel structures, right? That industrialize the landscape, you know. So it sounds like the footprint is just going to be enormous.
Well, the footprint is enormous, and one of the inherently unsolvable problems of wind and solar renewables, whatever you want to call them, is that it is a passive energy gathering system. So you're gathering and you're harvesting energy from the natural environment. And you need a far-flung system to gather that much energy, and then you have to route it in a concentrated form to where it's going to be used. Nuclear is the opposite approach. You have an incredibly dense fuel. It's actual fuel. It's not sunshine. It's so dense that 1 pound of it equals 100,000 pounds of coal as far as the amount of energy you can get out of it. And the other thing is the mining footprint the guy talked about. Well, Breakthrough Institute has already shown that the mining to build a nuclear plant is a fraction of building the similar amounts of wind and solar. Then the wind and solar guys go, yeah, but you guys got to keep digging for fuel until the cows come home, where our fuel is free. Well, one thing is not fuel, but we'll get into that. But they have a point about once their build is done, except for the replacements, panels and the blades, they don't have to do any more digging, but we have to keep doing digging. Well, there has been work in the last several years about extracting uranium from seawater, which you may have heard of. Yeah. It's a plastic sponge that you just dangle in the water and it soaks up uranium. I'm not kidding. And then they rinse it out and use the sponge again. MIT did a lot of work on it about 5 or 6 years ago, and they said, well, that might cost about $200 a kilo, and uranium's going for 80. Well, yeah. There's a new paper that came out, and I sent it to my science genius friend, Stephen Boyd, and they are claiming the ability to now pull uranium out of the ocean to match the spot price on the mined market. If that can be industrialized, as they say, we have solved all fuel, no more mining for fuel for freaking ever. And there's 4.5 billion tons of uranium in the ocean that is accessible because it's all in the shallow water, the top of the ocean. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And usually in shallow water by the shore, because it's fed by granite, you know, streams going through granite mountains to bring down uranium, et cetera. If you completely eliminated all fuel mining for reactors, you could then, that basically dismantles the wind and solar claim of, we don't have to mine for our fuel. Well, neither do we. And you guys take way more material to build your stuff than we do. So what are you even at the table for? Mm. You know, other than to put your stuff on what we built and say, look how well our stuff works, which is the marginal energy. It's marginal energy. Your wind and solar can only perform as it is now because it's being backed up by a fueled system as and as needed.
No, I mean, I kind of lament the fracking revolution because I think the nuclear renaissance was kind of underway to a degree, because really, if you run out of firm power in the form of fossil, you're not going to build wind and solar because you have no backup for that intermittency. And I mean, unless you entertain, hydrogen or kind of batteries as a panacea solution.
Right. Well, hydrogen is not a solution because hydrogen is a carrier of energy and is not a fuel. In other words, you only get energy, a fraction of the energy you put out of the hydrogen, put into the hydrogen. You're only going to get a fraction out. So if you use this much energy to put it into hydrogen, you're going to get this much energy out of that hydrogen. So it's an energy carrier, and it's very inefficient. It's about 20% round trip, which is from the windmill to the generator to the gizmo that makes the hydrogen, to put the hydrogen in the car, to run the electric motor in the car. It's like a 20% efficiency. And so first you have wind and solar. Solar is like 20% efficient. And then you're going to get 20% out of that, which is 4%, which means if you have a solar field that's making hydrogen for cars, only 4% of the energy that falls on those panels is going to wind up turning those wheels.
Right. That
sucks. Whereas a reactor, if you want to use hydrogen, I'm not crazy about it, but it'll work. It's much more efficient to use a reactor that operates at 93 or 4% efficiency to make the hydrogen. So then you get 20% of that 94%, not 20% of the 20%.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
I wanted to close with one last question again on this issue of firming renewables. You guys talk about the need for kind of training wheels on Mark Z Jacobson's system until you get to a very high penetration. You're relying on something as backup. That's looking like natural gas. You guys have a worth it metric that you use to talk about. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, if you have gas-backed renewables, you're going to have a certain amount. You're going to have a certain amount of CO2 from burning the gas, but you're also going to have a far more significant degree is the leak rate, the rate of leak from the field to the gas plant. And in the United States of America, it was remeasured and we're leaking 2.3%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that 2.3%, that small amount of gas that leaks is 84 times as with global warming, has 84 times more global warming potential than the CO2. So gas is okay when you burn it, it's half the CO2, but it's way more CO2 equivalent if it leaks than it does leak. And so if your wind and solar efficiency kind of sucks and you got to put in a bunch of gas, at a certain point, you are actually creating more CO2 or CO2 equivalent than a carbon fueled plant. So at a certain point of leak, like 4% leak, 3%, 4% leak, and you have a gas-backed renewable system, you're going to be as bad as a coal plant for the amount of global warming potential that system has because of the leak. And the thing is the wind and solar plant cannot control the leak because the leak is in the gas company, which is another system in another industry. So they are being delivered backup energy from another industry that has a leak.
Right.
So that's how you add all that. So you get to a worth it threshold where it's just not worth doing because you're not going to save any more. And we're 60% of the way to 4% leak with 2.3%. And so still fully 60% of the climate savings you thought you'd get with a gas-backed wind and solar field goes right up the chimney. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just, and also you have the problem about fuel not being on site at the gas plant. So then you have an infrastructure supply in a bad weather spell like Texas as well, where again, nuclear has all their fuel right on site. Mm-hmm. It's a 2-year battery is what it is.
Yeah.
The reactor is a 2-year battery, all weather, 24/7, 365, hurricanes, maybe tornadoes. I mean, they might screw up the electrical goodies, but not the reactor itself.
Yeah. Mike, I think we're going to have to leave it there because I don't like to go much over an hour.
Right.
But it's been really eye-opening having you on. I really do recommend that people check out your online published book, Roadmap to Nowhere. Just tell us briefly about the projects that you have coming up. I think you and Tim Mahoney are collaborating again.
Me and Tim, when we were thinking about revising Roadmap to Nowhere a couple years ago, and then we got to chapter 2, and we're like, it just started expanding and expanding. And chapter 2 was all about nuclear fear and why people are afraid and what they're afraid of and what the math and science really is on these things they're afraid of. And it grew in the whole book. And the book is called Fear of a Nuclear Planet. And it is specifically addressed to people that are like, well, yeah, this reactor stuff sounds a lot better than Minnesota, but Fukushima and Chernobyl and oh my God, 3 Mile Island, oh my God. You know what happened at 3 Mile Island? An unscheduled chest x-ray. The worst dose downwind from 3 Mile Island was equivalent to 1 human chest x-ray. Mm-hmm. So we basically shut down the nuclear power in this country because of some unscheduled chest x-rays.
Yeah.
So that's nuclear fear. It's way overblown. It's sort of like there's a reactor on the porch. We can't get in the house. Okay, well, let's build a big staircase in the backyard to go up to the attic. And going through all this Rube Goldbergian stuff instead of just walk around the reactor. It's not dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's a weird analogy, but I think you get my point. It's just like, if you are afraid of nuclear, you're not going to choose it. Again, if the only thing that came out of a reactor was chocolate syrup, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Mm-hmm. Mark Jacobson would be in some other field.
Yeah.
Because it's predicated on nuclear fear. And the nuclear fear is hugely overblown. Yeah. And our book, Fear of a Nuclear Planet, goes into it in stunning detail and easy to read. And I wanted to explain it like Einstein says, if you really understand something, you can explain it to your grandmother.
Yeah.
And this book, The Fear of Nuclear Planet, is dedicated to my grandmother, who taught me to read 2 months after I turned 4.
Yeah.
I remember the moment. Where she pointed and I said, that's the.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's nuclear fear is what's stopping us. And that's the thing we have to tackle.
Yeah.
Because all this other stuff is an academic discussion if you're afraid of it. So that's
all right. Well, we'll look forward to that book coming out, and we'll have you back to come and chat about that as well. Mike, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks again for making the time.
That was fun. It was fun. Let's do more.
All righty.
Okay, bye.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.